The day my neighbor stole 3 feet of my backyard, he smiled for the camera because he thought the law was standing beside him. The metallic pounding of a post driver shook my kitchen windows before the sun had fully climbed over the maple trees, and the smell of freshly poured concrete drifted through the screen door long before I even reached the porch. I stepped outside with a coffee mug still warm in my hand and froze. A brand new cedar fence stretched across my lawn like it had always belonged there. Workers in reflective vests were setting the last posts while a white luxury SUV sat in my driveway entrance, blocking my truck. Standing beside the survey stakes was my neighbor, Brandon Pierce, dressed in golf clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Next to him stood Linda Brooks, president of our HOA, holding a rolled-up site plan under one arm and wearing the confident smile of someone who had already decided the ending of the story. She didn't even wait for me to ask what was happening. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her voice sweet enough to sound rehearsed. "The updated property survey confirms the boundary adjustment. We're simply correcting an old mistake." My eyes dropped to the ground, where one of the workers tossed something into the back of a pickup truck. It wasn't scrap metal. It was an old brass survey marker covered in dirt. My stomach tightened so quickly I could almost taste the copper in the back of my throat. That marker had been in the ground longer than Brandon had been alive. My father had shown it to me when I was 12 years old, kneeling beside it on a humid summer afternoon while explaining that fences could move, landscaping could change, but survey monuments told the truth. Now it had been ripped out like it was nothing more than an old tent stake. Brandon walked over, sunglasses reflecting my own house back at me. "Looks like the line was never where you thought it was," he said with a shrug. "The HOA approved everything. You can take it up with them if you have questions." Behind him, the workers continued mixing concrete, the spinning drum humming steadily while gravel crunched beneath heavy boots. Every shovel of cement buried another piece of my family's history beneath fresh gray stone. I looked toward the giant oak tree that had shaded our backyard for decades. The new fence now cut directly across its roots. My lawn sprinkler line had already been severed, leaving a slow stream of water soaking into the soil. Linda unfolded the survey drawing just enough for me to see a bright red line running several feet inside what had always been my yard. "The county records support this revision," she said. "I'd recommend avoiding unnecessary conflict." I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand they stop. Instead, I kept staring at the empty hole where that brass monument had been. They thought removing a marker erased the truth. They had no idea that the one thing they should have feared wasn't the fence, the paperwork, or even the HOA. It was the survey they hadn't seen yet. I stood there until the last truck rolled away and the neighborhood fell quiet again. The smell of wet concrete lingered in the warm morning air while robins hopped across the fresh dirt as if nothing unusual had happened. From the street, the fence looked perfectly ordinary. That was the dangerous part. The cleanest lies usually looked the most believable. I walked slowly across what had been my backyard, counting each familiar step from the patio to the old oak tree. 27 steps. It had always been 27. Now the new fence stopped me at 19. 8 steps of my family's land had disappeared before breakfast. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 39 years old, and I have spent nearly 2 decades as a civil engineer helping cities design roads, drainage systems, and public infrastructure. Most people assume engineers spend their lives staring at blueprints. The truth is that we spend far more time solving problems created by people who believed measurements did not matter. Numbers always tell the truth eventually. That lesson came from my father long before I ever earned a degree. My father, Richard Walker, worked as a licensed land surveyor for 38 years across central Ohio. He was not the loudest man in any room, but everyone listened when he unfolded a survey map across the hood of his pickup truck. He used to bring me along during summer vacations, letting me carry wooden stakes that felt twice as heavy as they actually were. I still remember the smell of fresh-cut pine mixed with diesel fuel while his total station clicked across open farmland under the July sun. He never rushed. Every measurement had to be checked twice because, as he loved to remind me, people forget conversations, but they rarely forget property lines. On one of those afternoons, we stood beside the exact brass monument that Brandon's crew had pulled from the ground that morning. Dad brushed away the dirt with nothing more than his work glove and tapped the metal cap with the handle of his hammer. The sharp ringing sound echoed through the trees. He smiled and looked at me. "Ethan," he said, "people move fences every year. Some do it by accident. Some do it because they think nobody will notice. But this little piece of brass does not care about opinions. It only knows where the line belongs." At 12 years old, I did not understand why he sounded almost proud of something buried underground. Today I understood perfectly. After Dad passed away 5 years earlier, I inherited the house along with every folder, notebook, and filing cabinet he had kept organized in the detached garage. I never had the heart to throw any of it away. Most evenings after work, I would unlock the garage, breathe in the familiar scent of aged paper, machine oil, and old cedar shelves, and feel like he had only stepped out for another survey job. That garage held more than memories. It held the habits of a man who believed every answer was somewhere inside careful records. As I stared at the empty hole where the brass monument had once rested, I realized something Brandon and Linda had completely overlooked. My father never trusted a single marker to tell the whole story. The next morning, I drove straight to the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse with a folder tucked beneath my arm and more questions than answers. The building smelled like fresh coffee, lemon furniture polish, and expensive air freshener, the kind that tries a little too hard to feel welcoming. Linda Brooks was already sitting at the conference table flipping through a stack of violation notices as though she had been expecting me. Brandon Pierce leaned casually against the window, stirring a cup of coffee with the confidence of a man who believed every important decision had already been made. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. Linda offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "Ethan, I was hoping you would come in so we could clear up the misunderstanding." She slid a laminated neighborhood plat across the polished wood table. A thick red line marked my property several feet shorter than every memory I had carried for 39 years. The map looked official. County logos, survey references, approval stamps. Everything someone needed to convince ordinary homeowners that arguing would only make things worse. I studied the document carefully without saying a word. Something about it felt wrong, but I could not immediately explain why. Brandon folded his arms. "I already signed the contract for my pool installation," he said. "The contractor starts excavation next week. We are finally making good use of that wasted strip of land." He said wasted like my father's vegetable garden, my old tire swing, and countless family barbecues had never existed. Linda reached into another folder and placed an HOA compliance notice in front of me. According to the letter, I was prohibited from interfering with approved improvements or entering the disputed area until the matter was considered resolved. Resolved. It amazed me how easily one word could erase decades of history. I looked out the clubhouse window toward the neighborhood pond where a pair of ducks drifted quietly across perfectly still water. Everything outside looked peaceful while my property line disappeared beneath paperwork inside the building. Before leaving, I stopped at the county recorder's office hoping to compare their records with the map Linda had shown me. The courthouse lobby echoed with footsteps across polished tile, and the faint smell of old paper mixed with fresh printer toner filled the air. A clerk pulled up the digital parcel map on her computer. My stomach tightened again. The screen matched Linda's version exactly. The revised boundary was already in the county database. "According to our records," the clerk said politely, "this update was processed about 6 months ago." 6 months. Long before the fence appeared. Long before Brandon ordered building materials. Long before I realized anything had changed. I thanked her and walked back into the parking lot with the afternoon sun reflecting off windshields so brightly I had to shield my eyes. For the first time since inheriting the house, doubt quietly crept into my mind. Had I somehow remembered everything wrong? Then another memory surfaced with perfect clarity. My father never relied on county copies alone. Every survey he completed generated multiple originals stored in different places because, as he often said with a quiet grin, records could be updated, computers could fail, and maps could be redrawn. But the truth was never supposed to exist in only one file. I spent the next 3 days knocking on every door that was supposed to protect property rights, and every single one closed a little faster than the last. The county planning office politely referred me back to the recorder's office. The recorder's office pointed toward the updated digital records. My homeowner's insurance representative explained that boundary disputes were excluded until ownership had been legally established. Even the attorney I consulted leaned back in his leather chair, adjusted his glasses, and told me that challenging a recorded survey could cost more than $100,000 before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. His office smelled of fresh coffee and old law books, and the soft ticking of a brass clock on the wall somehow made every second feel more expensive. I thanked him for his time, carried my folder back to the truck, and sat in silence while the air conditioner pushed warm summer air through the vents. Every answer sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they formed a perfect trap. Meanwhile, Brandon wasted no time turning his imaginary victory into something permanent. Every afternoon, another delivery truck arrived. The rumble of diesel engines echoed through the neighborhood as pallets of pavers, landscaping blocks, and decorative shrubs were unloaded exactly where my family had once planted tomatoes every spring. I watched crews measure, dig, and level the ground with cheerful efficiency. They were not acting like people worried about making a mistake. They were acting like people who believed every permit had already been approved. Linda seemed to enjoy reminding everyone of that fact. At the monthly HOA meeting, she stood beside a projection screen displaying the updated neighborhood map and congratulated Brandon for investing in improvements that would increase surrounding property values. Several neighbors applauded. A few smiled politely in my direction with the uncomfortable expression people wear when they suspect something is wrong but do not want to become involved. I could almost hear the quiet calculations happening inside their heads. If the county agreed with the HOA, then Ethan must be mistaken. After the meeting, one older neighbor named Harold caught up with me in the parking lot. He lowered his voice before speaking. "Your father surveyed my property 20 years ago," he said. "He never missed by an inch." Then he glanced toward Linda's SUV and sighed. "I just do not know how to prove it." Neither did I. At least not yet. By the end of the week, Brandon's backyard looked like an outdoor showroom. Fresh sod rolled across the ground in neat green strips. New irrigation pipes disappeared beneath the soil. Decorative stone edging curved gracefully around what would soon become a swimming pool. Every improvement crossed the line I had walked since childhood, yet every receipt he signed made him believe he was investing in land that belonged to him. That evening, I stood alone inside my detached garage with only a single work light glowing above the old wooden workbench. Dust floated through the beam while shelves packed with binders cast long shadows across the concrete floor. The familiar scent of cedar, machine oil, and aging paper settled my nerves more than any conversation had all week. I slowly ran my fingers across the labels my father had written decades earlier in careful black. Marker, township surveys, boundary adjustments, monument records, easement files. He had organized everything with the patience of someone who expected future questions long before anyone asked them. I realized then that everyone else had been searching for answers inside computers and official databases. My father had trusted something much older than either of those. He trusted his own records, and for the first time since the fence went up, I believed they were about to tell a very different story. I opened the first filing cabinet just after sunset, and the rusty drawer groaned exactly the way it had when I was a teenager sneaking into my father's workshop looking for spare nails or fishing gear. The sound stopped me for a moment because it felt like stepping backward through time. Every folder sat perfectly upright, separated by handwritten tabs in my father's unmistakable block lettering. He never trusted fancy software. He trusted paper, pencils, and discipline. Dust coated the tops of the binders, but inside everything looked as though he had organized it the day before. The faint smell of aging blueprints mixed with cedar shelves and machine oil filled the garage, and for the first time all week, my heartbeat finally slowed. I started with the property survey completed when my parents bought the house 34 years earlier. Then I found the boundary verification completed after the new subdivision was built on the neighboring farmland. Every document listed the same dimensions. Every measurement matched the memories I had carried since childhood. I unfolded another large plat map across the workbench, holding the corners down with old steel tape measures. There it was, a small handwritten note in the margin that caught my attention. Primary monument verified. Secondary control monument installed due to future development. I frowned. I did not remember Dad ever mentioning a second monument. I searched deeper through another binder until a yellow envelope slipped from between two field books and landed on the concrete floor with a soft thud. Inside were photographs developed long before digital cameras became common. My father stood beside survey equipment, smiling beneath a faded baseball cap while holding a survey rod. Behind him, partially hidden beneath fresh soil, was another brass monument embedded in reinforced concrete several yards away from the one Brandon's crew had removed. I turned the photo over. On the back, my father had written a date, precise coordinates, and one short sentence. Permanent control. Never disclose unless primary marker is disturbed. I stared at those words for several seconds without moving. Dad had anticipated exactly this possibility decades ago. He knew that visible monuments could disappear. He knew careless construction crews or dishonest people might someday move them. That was why he quietly established an independent control point that could verify every original measurement if the primary marker was ever compromised. My pulse quickened as I pulled another notebook from the shelf. Inside were pages filled with field sketches, bearing angles, elevation notes, weather conditions, and coordinate calculations written in sharp mechanical pencil. Every page supported the existence of the hidden control monument. This was not just family history. This was professional evidence created by a licensed surveyor following accepted standards. Outside, I heard the steady beeping of construction equipment as Brandon's contractors continued working late into the evening. They were installing decorative stone around the future pool while landscape lights illuminated the yard they believed was permanently theirs. I walked to the garage window and watched them for several quiet minutes. The temptation to march outside with the photographs and notebooks tugged at me, but another lesson from my father surfaced instead. He used to tell clients that the strongest case was never the one presented first. It was the one presented when every fact had already been verified beyond argument. I carefully returned every photograph to its envelope, closed the notebook, and locked the filing cabinet. Brandon thought he had removed the only piece of evidence that mattered. He had no idea the real proof had been buried deeper than either of us had ever imagined. I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I stopped arguing. I stopped sending emails. I stopped knocking on office doors asking people to believe me. Brandon probably mistook my silence for surrender because the construction accelerated almost overnight. Every morning, another truck rolled into his driveway carrying stone, lumber, pool equipment, or fresh landscaping. The steady hiss of nail guns blended with the rumble of compact excavators, while the smell of cut lumber and fresh mulch drifted across my yard. The fence was stained a rich cedar color. Landscape lights appeared along the new walkway. By the end of the second week, the curved outline of an in-ground swimming pool had taken shape exactly where my father and I used to toss a baseball every Sunday afternoon. Every improvement rested on land that I knew had never legally changed ownership. But I refused to interrupt a single worker. Instead, I focused on building something much more valuable than an argument. I contacted an independent surveying company nearly 60 miles away, choosing professionals with no connection to the county, the subdivision, or anyone who might recognize Brandon or Linda. I explained the situation without exaggeration and asked only one question. If an original control monument still exists, can you verify every boundary from that point alone? The licensed surveyor on the other end paused for a moment before answering. If the monument is authentic and undisturbed, it becomes the strongest physical evidence on the property. Those were exactly the words I had hoped to hear. 2 days later, I met the survey team before sunrise inside my garage. They spread my father's notebooks across the workbench, comparing handwritten coordinates with modern satellite data. The quiet clicking of laptop keyboards mixed with the rustle of old survey plats, while steaming cups of coffee filled the room with the familiar smell Dad always associated with early field work. One of the surveyors, a gray-haired man named Thomas Reed, examined the photographs through a magnifying glass before looking up at me. "Your father documented everything," he said softly. "People do not keep records like this anymore." Hearing another professional respect my father's work gave me more confidence than any attorney ever had. Thomas recommended one more step before anyone touched the property. We would request an official county boundary verification performed in the presence of both property owners. That way, every observation, every measurement, and every recovered monument would become part of the public record. I filed the request that same afternoon without mentioning the hidden control monument or my father's photographs. Brandon received the notice 3 days later. I watched from my front porch as he opened the certified envelope, laughed, and casually tossed it onto the passenger seat of his truck before walking back to admire the nearly finished pool. Linda arrived later that evening carrying another folder of HOA paperwork. The two of them stood beside the new fence smiling as they discussed final landscaping plans. They looked completely relaxed. Why would they not be? They believed every government record supported their position. They believed the visible survey marker had been the only one that mattered. They believed expensive improvements made ownership look permanent. As the sun disappeared behind the oak trees, golden light reflected across the fresh water beginning to fill Brandon's new pool. I quietly locked my garage for the night, knowing something neither of them could possibly imagine. In less than 2 weeks, every inch they proudly celebrated would be measured against a monument they never knew existed, and the truth buried beneath the ground was finally about to speak for itself. The morning of the official survey arrived cooler than the rest of the week, with a light breeze carrying the scent of damp grass and fresh coffee through the neighborhood before the first lawn mower ever started. I was already outside when 2 white survey trucks turned slowly onto our street, their amber lights flashing against rows of quiet houses. Thomas Reed stepped out first, followed by 2 licensed survey technicians carrying tripods, GPS receivers, and bright orange equipment cases that looked almost surgical in their precision. A county surveyor arrived only minutes later in a separate vehicle, followed by a deputy whose presence was less about conflict and more about ensuring everyone respected the process. Brandon walked out of his backyard wearing an expensive polo shirt, coffee mug in one hand, and an amused smile on his face. Linda appeared moments later carrying another thick binder of HOA documents, greeting everyone with the polished confidence she always wore during board meetings. "This should not take very long," she said cheerfully. "The county records are perfectly clear." Thomas simply nodded without responding. Surveyors, like engineers, tend to let measurements speak before opinions. The equipment was assembled with quiet efficiency. Tripods locked into place with sharp metallic clicks. Satellite receivers blinked to life. A small drone lifted gently into the air, its soft hum floating above the rooftops as it mapped the property from above. Several neighbors wandered outside after noticing the unusual activity. Some leaned against mailboxes while others stood quietly at the ends of their driveways pretending to check the morning weather. Curiosity spread faster than conversation. Brandon watched with folded arms while one technician began locating the surviving reference points shown in my father's field notes. Every modern measurement matched the old coordinates within fractions of an inch. Thomas smiled almost imperceptibly before opening the weathered envelope containing my father's photographs. He showed them privately to the county surveyor, who studied the handwritten coordinates for several silent moments before looking toward the section of lawn near the old oak tree. "Let us check there," he finally said. One technician unpacked a professional metal locator and slowly swept it across the ground. The device remained silent at first. Then a faint electronic chirp echoed through the still morning air. He moved back and forth more carefully. The chirp became a steady tone. Brandon's smile faded just slightly. Linda shifted her weight without saying a word. The technician marked a small circle on the grass with bright orange paint before carefully removing only a few inches of soil using hand tools. Instead of machinery, everyone watched without speaking. Even the birds seemed unusually quiet. After several minutes, the edge of a round brass cap appeared beneath the dirt, untouched and exactly where my father's notes predicted it would be. Thomas brushed away the remaining soil with a small nylon brush until the engraved survey license number became visible in the morning sunlight. The county surveyor crouched beside it, compared the identification with the field records, then slowly stood back up. His expression had completely changed. He looked toward Brandon's brand new fence, then toward the pool, then finally at Linda. "This is the original permanent control monument," he said calmly. "Every official boundary on these adjoining parcels will now be recalculated from this point." The words were not loud, but they settled over the neighborhood with the weight of absolute certainty. Brandon looked toward the fence as though seeing it for the very first time, while Linda quietly lowered the binder she had carried so confidently only minutes earlier. The survey continued with the kind of quiet precision that only professionals seem capable of maintaining when everyone else is holding their breath. Thomas and the county surveyor compared coordinates, checked bearings, and verified distances from the recovered control monument to every visible corner of both properties. The rhythmic beeping of the GPS receiver echoed across the lawns while the drone completed one final pass overhead. Nobody interrupted them. Nobody argued. Every number appeared on their screens exactly where my father's handwritten notes said it would. After nearly 2 hours, the county surveyor gathered everyone near the new cedar fence. He unfolded a fresh field map that had been generated from the verified measurements and laid it across the hood of his truck. The paper fluttered gently in the breeze before he placed a measuring tape across it. "The original recorded boundary has not changed," he said in a calm, even voice. "The digital parcel update does not match the recovered control monument or the historical survey documentation." Brandon stepped forward immediately. "There has to be some mistake," he insisted. "The county database already approved everything." The county surveyor shook his head. "Databases display information. Monuments establish legal boundaries." The sentence hung in the air like the final piece of a puzzle. Linda slowly opened her binder, flipping through pages that suddenly seemed to carry very little weight. She searched for something, anything, that might contradict what every instrument had just confirmed. There was nothing. Thomas then walked to the fence and stretched a survey tape toward the recovered monument. One orange flag after another appeared in the grass, each marking the true property line exactly where I remembered it from childhood. Every flag landed several feet inside Brandon's newly landscaped yard. The decorative stone border crossed the line. The irrigation system crossed the line. The cedar fence crossed the line. Even one curved edge of the newly finished pool extended beyond the legal boundary. Neighbors watched in complete silence as realization slowly spread from one face to another. Harold removed his cap and quietly smiled in my direction. Brandon stared at the orange flags without saying a word, his earlier confidence replaced by the expression of someone trying to understand how certainty had disappeared so quickly. Linda finally broke the silence. "Can this simply be corrected with revised paperwork?" she asked carefully. The county surveyor answered without hesitation. "No. The public record must be corrected to reflect the verified boundary, and any improvements located across that boundary will have to be addressed according to property law." Those words carried more weight than any HOA notice ever could. Over the following weeks, official letters replaced confident conversations. The county restored the correct parcel records. Contractors returned, but this time they were removing sections of the cedar fence instead of installing them. Decorative stone was carefully lifted one piece at a time. Irrigation lines were rerouted. Landscaping that had taken days to install disappeared in careful reverse order. Engineers reviewed the pool layout to determine what modifications were necessary to bring every structure back within the legal property line. Brandon stood quietly in his yard during much of the work, speaking very little. Linda resigned from the HOA board before the next monthly meeting, and a new president was elected soon afterward with a promise that future decisions would always require independent verification before affecting any homeowner's property. Watching the crews carefully undo weeks of construction, I realized my father had been right all along. Fences could be moved. Maps could be updated. Databases could contain errors. But the truth, once measured from the right point, had a remarkable way of putting everything else back where it belonged. 3 months later, the neighborhood looked almost exactly the way it had before all of this began, except now I noticed details I had taken for granted my entire life. The old oak tree stretched across the backyard again, without a fence cutting through its roots. My sprinkler system watered the grass in its original pattern every morning, filling the air with the clean scent of damp earth that reminded me of childhood summers. The section of lawn everyone had fought over measured only a few feet across, yet standing there I understood it had never been about the size of the land. It had been about whether facts still mattered when confidence, paperwork, and influence all pointed in the wrong direction. One cool Saturday morning, Thomas Reed returned with the county surveyor for one final visit. They installed a new permanent surface marker directly above the protected control monument, carefully documenting every measurement before sealing the official records. The steady tap of the brass setting tool echoed across the quiet yard, almost identical to the sound I remembered from decades earlier when my father had shown me the first monument. For a moment, I closed my eyes and could almost hear his voice explaining bearings, distances, and why patience always outlasted shortcuts. Before leaving, Thomas handed me a certified copy of the updated survey along with the corrected county plat. "Keep these somewhere safe," he said with a smile. "The next generation should not have to solve the same problem twice." I promised him they would not. A few weeks later, the neighborhood held its annual summer picnic beside the community pond. Families gathered beneath white tents while children chased each other through the grass, and the smell of grilled hamburgers drifted across the park. Several neighbors stopped to thank me, not because I had won an argument, but because the corrected records protected every property surrounding ours as well. Harold shook my hand and quietly admitted he had scheduled a fresh survey for his own lot just for peace of mind. Others nodded in agreement. What had started as one dispute had reminded everyone that accurate records were not an inconvenience. They were the foundation of trust between neighbors. Brandon eventually walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He looked uncomfortable, searching for words that did not come easily. After a long pause, he simply said, "I should have asked more questions before I started building." I nodded. There was nothing left to prove. Sometimes accountability arrives without anyone raising their voice. We stood there for a few moments watching the pond shimmer beneath the afternoon sun before he quietly returned to his family. As for Linda, I never saw her at another HOA meeting. Life moved forward, just as it always does. That evening, I unlocked my father's garage one more time and placed every notebook, photograph, and survey map back onto the same shelves where he had left them. Then I added one more folder beside his work. Inside were the new certified survey, the corrected county records, and a photograph of the restored property line with the brass marker shining in the late afternoon light. I closed the filing cabinet gently, switched off the workshop light, and listened to the familiar click of the lock. People can move fences. They can redraw maps. They can even convince an entire neighborhood that a mistake is the truth. But they cannot change what honest measurements reveal, and they certainly cannot erase a legacy built on integrity. My father was right. The truth does not need to shout. It only needs the right point from which to be measured, because justice is never the loudest voice in the neighborhood. It is simply the one that refuses to move.